As the US considers declaring global warming a national emergency and Europe swelters under record temperatures, has the climate crisis reached a turning point? Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. With just 4 months until the next annual UN meeting on climate change, and with record-breaking temperatures and heat waves sweeping across Europe, the US, and other parts of the world, the UN says it is further proof that the world is on a fast track to disaster, warning that it is now or never to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The UN also warns that India, which is set to overtake China as the world's most populous nation in 2023, could face widespread water shortages affecting 40% of its population by 2050. Now, with over 1.4 billion people, India accounts for 17% of the world's population and is the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Its rapid population growth is creating more demand for fossil fuels and a renewed reliance on coal. We traveled to Kerala in southern India to see the impacts of climate change, with rising sea levels and increased rainfall threatening the coastal city's fishermen and its rice farmers.
ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുന്നതെന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ ശാസ്ത്രീയമായി ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുന്ന ഇവിടെ ഇതിലെ പോകുന്ന തോടുകൾ എല്ലാം നല്ലപോലെ ഇറിഗേഷൻ ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെൻറ്റ് കുഴിച്ചു കൊടുത്തു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ തോട്ടപ്പള്ളിയിലേക്ക് സുഖമായിട്ട് വെള്ളമൊഴുക്ക് വരും. വെള്ളമൊഴുക്ക് വരുമ്പോൾ നല്ല വെള്ളം വന്നു കഴിയുമ്പോൾ കിഴക്കുന്ന നല്ല വെള്ളം വന്നു കഴിഞ്ഞ് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ഈ ഒഴുക്ക് വന്നു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ തന്നെ നല്ല വെള്ളം കയറി നല്ല കൃഷി, നല്ല നെല്ലുണ്ടാകും. ജീവിക്കാൻ പറ്റത്തില്ല. ഓരോരുത്തവരിപ്പം കടങ്ങി ആത്മഹത്യയുടെ ഒരു അവസ്ഥയിൽ എത്തിച്ചേർന്നേക്കാണ്.
ഇല്ല, ഞങ്ങൾ കാലങ്ങളായിട്ട് ഇവിടെ തന്നെ താമസിക്കുന്ന ആൾക്കാരാണ്. കുട്ടനാട്ടിൽ തന്നെയാണ്. കുട്ടനാട്ടിലെ വെള്ളപ്പൊക്കമൊക്കെ അതിജീവിച്ച് ഇങ്ങനെ ജീവിക്കുന്നു. കഴിഞ്ഞ 2008 വെള്ളപ്പൊക്കത്തിന് എൻ്റെ വീട്ടിൽ മാത്രമേ വെള്ളം കയറാതുള്ളൂ. ബാക്കി ഈ പ്രദേശമുള്ള എല്ലാ വീട്ടിലും കയറി. എൻ്റെ വീട്ടിൽ ഒരു 4 ഇഞ്ചിനടുത്ത് പൊക്കം കൂടെ ഉള്ളായിരുന്നു. എനിക്കിവിടെ പശുക്കളൊക്കെ ഉള്ള കാരണം എനിക്കങ്ങ് പോകാൻ പറ്റിയില്ല. ഇവിടെ ഒരു പാലത്തെ കെട്ടിയിരിക്കുകയായിരുന്നു പശുക്കളൊക്കെ. കടൽ ഇരയ്ക്കുന്നത് പണ്ട് വല്ല സമയത്തൊക്കെ കർക്കിടകത്തിലൊക്കെ കേൾക്കാറുള്ളൂ. ഇപ്പോൾ എപ്പോഴും കടലിരിക്കുന്ന സൗണ്ടാണ്. ഇവിടെ നിന്ന് നമുക്ക് കേൾക്കാൻ പറ്റും സാറിന്. ഒരു 6-7 മണി ആകുമ്പോഴത്തേക്ക് കടലിരയ്ക്കുന്നത് നമുക്ക് കേൾക്കാം. അപ്പോൾ അവിടെ ഏറ്റമായി. അപ്പോൾ ഈ വെള്ളം അങ്ങോട്ട് ഇറങ്ങി പോകാൻ പറ്റുകയില്ല. അപ്പോൾ ഇതൊക്കെ നമ്മൾ സാധാരണ കണ്ടുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്ന കാര്യമാണ്. അപ്പോൾ ഇപ്പോൾ മീൻപിടുത്തക്കാരും പറയും ഏറ്റമാണ്, വെള്ളം ഇറങ്ങത്തില്ല എന്ന് പറയും.
India is not alone, of course, in its fight against climate change. Small island nations like Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, with a population of less than 1.3 million, are highly vulnerable to the devastating impacts of rising sea levels, flooding, and tropical cyclones. Ameenah Gurib-Fakim is the former president of Mauritius and a biodiversity scientist. She joins me now. President Gurib-Fakim, thank you so much for being with me. It's great to have you on the program. Mauritius, which is just off the eastern coast of Africa, accounts for only 0.01% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The entire African continent has produced less than 3% of carbon emissions, but it has been highly impacted by the global emissions of wealthy nations. Now, you've called it an existential threat to humanity. Mauritius is among the world's biodiversity hotspots. Just how urgent is the situation for a country like yours, and just how crucial is it to protect its ecosystems?
Thank you, first of all, Hida, for having me. And it's very important to have this conversation. You have rightly said, climate change for us islanders is an existential threat. Why is this? Because first of all, we occupy less than 2% of the world's, the planet's surface. But what people don't know or don't realize is that we have the web of life that is supporting the humanity. The existence of humanity as we know it. And so what people will say if islands disappear? And we support the ecosystem, and island countries with the ecosystem that we have, they actually provide over 40% of ecosystemic services to vulnerable people. More than this, the ecosystem provides us with medicine, with food, with just about everything we need. And of course, they also provide us with new solutions to future challenges that humanity will face. And unfortunately, when scientists talk about tipping point, they are talking precisely about the destruction of this ecosystem. And don't forget, small islands, they also have coral reef, and coral reef actually encompass 25% of marine biodiversity. So this is what we are faced up with, is that the destruction of the very web that is supporting life on Earth. And as I have said all the time, and I will say it again, we are, when I say we, because I still think that we're all living on the same one planet, we are destroying the branch that is keeping us all together.
You make a compelling case, both as a scientist and as a former head of state. I mean, are political leaders in the countries that matter listening? You've been involved in climate negotiations at the highest levels for many years. Are politicians taking it seriously enough? It always seems to be on the back burner until the next elections.
It has been on the back burner, as rightly said, until the next election. But I think, unfortunately, I will be very blunt here. It's only when the North is impacted that they're now taking this seriously. And I think recently we've heard this narrative coming out of President Biden in terms of climate emergency. You know, climate change has been affecting many countries in the global South, but nobody seemed to care. Now people care because we're seeing the impact in the global North.
Will leaders in the North and the global South take the steps needed? Because the next climate conference summit, which is just a few months away, risks being yet another PR event for world leaders, nothing more.
It's happening. People are waking up, but unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to say this: the media is not playing its part, because it is not actually, primetime news when people actually walk against the damages of climate. So I think we all have to come together, hand in hand, the public, and there is a wake-up call in the global South as well. We have been shouting, we have been, clamoring for many years, but now that is happening in the North. So we are hopeful that things will now be taken seriously.
Does it matter, though, how much you and other low-emitting countries in the global South do? Because I know that Mauritius is one of 29 African countries that have committed to curbing their emissions by 40% by 2030. But will it matter very much if wealthy countries responsible for most of the damage don't do their share, if there isn't this more equitable burden sharing?
We've contributed, we have given the figure 0.01%. And we know that Africa has contributed less than 3%. I mean, 3%, I think what the wake-up call is for the global North is that they have to reduce emission. I mean, there is no two way about it. You have to reduce emission. Just want to remember also some facts and figures. Any gram of carbon emitted now as we speak will stay in the atmosphere for 20,000 years.
But even if they acted now and cut their emissions drastically, many scientists are saying that it may be too late. Now, we often talk as well about climate finance and how wealthy developed nations need to live up to their broken commitments to help poorer developing nations adapt to the climate emergency that they created. How important is climate finance, or is that the wrong approach? Should African nations focus more on breaking their energy dependency on wealthy nations in the North, to develop their own localized mechanisms, to make their own transition to green energy?
Yes, there has to be climate finance, because we have to close the gap, because we already know that there is a gap of about $26 billion from the 100 billion which have been pledged since Paris. And of course, people haven't actually responded, and of course, topped up the green fund. That's one area, because it will also help us access technology with the appropriate funding. But I think you have rightly said, Africa now has to move away from this dependence, and Africa has all the resources. And Africa can, now we're already seeing it with the Ukraine crisis in terms of food security, Africa has all the resources to take. And also we mustn't forget that, as I've spoken about the resources, Africa has the resources, but I think we can do without the interference from outside, and let us get on with our own business.
Getting on with our business, what is the most realistic approach? Because you and I have had conversations over the last couple of years. You've always said that what we need isn't revolutionary change. We need realistic change. What does it look like? And do we really have the time to change things around?
Well, we again have to be realistic. It is not going to happen because the resources of Africa are highly sought after. If you look at a country like DRC, which is running the mobile industry, how much do they get in terms of payment? I mean, these are the realities we have to face up to. So it's all very nice to have this conversation about corruption and all the rest of it. But for every corruptee, there's a corrupter. And we can do with the taxes, we can do with people who are exploiting the resources of the continent, pay the dues. And I think this is only the time that we will be able to make headway, is that when we have the whole system of governance looked into, but of course with input from the global north, where most of the resources are going to.
Are you hopeful looking ahead towards COP27 and what comes after?
COP27, I think, is going to be, unfortunately, yet another meeting where pledges are made. But I think things will happen on the ground because I think people will be demanding change. We are seeing a lot of unrest in many countries. We've seen how bad governance leads the country to. We've seen the example of Sri Lanka. So we don't want that. So the youth will be awakening because don't forget that the fastest growing continent in terms of manpower generation for the young people will be Africa. So they are very much awake, and I'm seeing now a much more awakened youth in Africa, and they're very, very concerned about the state of the continent, and I'm sure they will be taking things in their hands.
And the clock is ticking. Ameenah Gurib-Fakim, former president of Mauritius, such a pleasure to see you again. Thank you for talking to me.
Thank you so much, Rita. It's a pleasure talking to you as always.
Global warming also poses a serious threat to low-lying small island nations in the Caribbean, whose very existence is under threat. Kishan Kumarsingh is head of multilateral agreements at the Ministry of Planning and Development in Trinidad and Tobago. He is co-chair of the new collective quantified goal on climate finance for 2022 and is his country's lead climate negotiator. He joins me now. Mr. Kumarsingh, it is island nations like Trinidad and Tobago that are bearing the brunt of climate change with rising sea levels. How existential a threat has climate change become for you?
Climate change poses a significant development threat and challenge for smaller and developing states in the Caribbean, such as Trinidad and Tobago, arising likely from the increased frequency of storms, for example, extreme weather events, extreme events such as floods, droughts, hurricanes, sea level rise. We are experiencing inundation of low-lying coastal areas with the attendant loss of coastal habitats. Increasing sea surface temperatures that are affecting coral reefs, the increasing pH or decreasing pH, increasing acidity of seawater that is also affecting coral reefs. Are you at
the point of no return, or is there still time for political leaders to act in order to avert the worst case scenarios?
Well, the projected rate of climate change, as evidenced by the scientific data provided by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, suggests that the trajectory to temperature increases to 2100 aims at 2.4 as a best case scenario, 2.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. At those temperature increases, we can virtually expect all of our coral reefs to disappear, as well as some of our socioeconomic supporting sectors such as agriculture and so on. So there will come a time, if climate change is not reined in, that we will perhaps cease to exist.
Can anyone, though, continue to have any kind of confidence in what political leaders have been saying for so many years? I mean, can they live up to their mantra of keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius alive? Or is it just a PR exercise that we see at every UN conference every single year?
That's perfectly true, but it's a global effort at the same time. And the only thing that will see this coming to reality is the issue of political will. But given the process, we have to actually persevere. The large wealthy countries now have to step up and really engender the trust and build that trust, because the trust has been lost by developing countries. I mean, it's not been lost by developed countries, and that the trust has been broken by developed countries in providing the climate finance. So any measure of outreach that can build bridges of trust and confidence now has to be done by developed countries.
But are we fooling ourselves, though, into thinking that we can still, quote, keep 1.5 degrees alive, as the mantra goes, when we're already at 1.1 degrees Celsius? I mean, what is the more realistic goal? How do you fix the problem in a fair and just way?
I hope we are not fooling ourselves. I think it's an absolute imperative for humankind, global humankind, that we actually stay on 1.5 degrees. The issue is not an issue of survival of developing countries versus developed countries. I mean, developed countries may be able to be technologically and financially capable of surviving to a point, but it will certainly redound to the benefit if all countries can react and build resilience to climate change and contribute to the 1.5 trajectory. The fact that that sea level rise will affect low-lying coasts does not necessarily mean that it affects only developing countries, only those vulnerable countries. It affects everyone. So, you know, providing climate finance, providing technology, providing capacity, not only assist countries like developing countries and small island states in building climate resiliency, but it really contributes to a global effort that goes forward. So, but there has to be a lead and a demonstrated lead taken by the wealthy countries in providing climate finance, for example, in providing capacity, in providing technology, because a rising tide lifts all boats. Eventually, if climate change reaches a point where there's a tipping point and there's runaway climate change, the world at large is going to be affected. No one will be spared.
As you say, it is a global crisis, a global emergency that will require global efforts as well. Kishan Kumarsingh, lead negotiator for Trinidad and Tobago on climate change. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Now, according to the UN's Humanitarian Office, people living in low-income countries are 4 times more likely to be displaced by extreme weather compared to people in rich countries, despite being the least responsible for climate change. A recent study by NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, shows that global warming is happening at a rate not seen in the past 10,000 years. Despite the changing patterns of global warming across the world, only 24 countries are reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, the US, Jamaica, and 22 countries in Europe. Wealthy nations are responsible for an estimated 92% of all global emissions, with the richest 1% responsible for twice as many emissions as the poorest 50%. In 2030, the carbon footprint of the world's wealthiest nations is expected to be 30 times larger than the level compatible with the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. By 2035, low-income countries are expected to produce only around 1% of global emissions. A recent study has found that 90% of plankton, which form the lowest rung of the marine food chain, have died off, threatening all marine life in the ocean. So can humanity survive the extinction of most marine plants and animals, as scientists have been warning? And can the world's wealthiest nations and biggest polluters still fix the problem? Joining me now is Daniel Kammen, Senior Advisor at USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. He is Professor of Energy at UC Berkeley and former Science Envoy at the U.S. State Department. Daniel Kammen, let me first ask you, as a coordinating lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the UN body that assesses the science related to climate change, about the warning contained in one of the last reports that, quote, we have very little time to deal with the climate crisis. We've been hearing these warnings, of course, for quite a while. How much time is very little time?
Very little time is under a decade. We know from the science that we need to get global carbon emissions to zero or near zero by mid-century 2050. And now, unfortunately, 5 years ago, we published a paper along with many other leaders in the IPCC process and the host of the Paris Climate Summit, Christina Figueres, that we need to launch real serious efforts this decade. And the reason for that is that energy systems are typically very long-lived. If we build another natural gas power plant today, it is likely to be operating well beyond 2050. So that timetable for action is we need political action now. We need deployment of clean energy now. We need to protect the oceans and poor and vulnerable people now. And only by doing real steps, not pilot projects, do we give ourselves a chance to make that mid-century clean global energy economy.
But can we really make all of that happen, including finding that political will in that narrow window? I mean, haven't we already passed the critical window? Can we undo any of the long-term damage, given the pace at which we're going? I mean, the leaders of almost 200 nations gathered at the last UN conference in Scotland. They made yet more pledges to cut their emissions, and only, 24 of them took any concrete measure to reduce their emissions. That's just 10%. How far
It's
off are
sad. We're making our job incredibly difficult. We still do have time, but that window is closing rapidly. And when we see countries adopt policies that encourage more fossil fuels or more deforestation, we make our job incredibly difficult. But all of that being said, we do see action even today that if we follow up on it, and that is a big if, will get us there. We just had the United States come to an agreement on a record new clean energy package that would put $369 billion into clean energy projects. The European community has adopted some significant measures. China has adopted a net zero carbon economy plan for 2060, which I would say is 10 years too late, but it's better than no plan. So we have a lot of the right initial steps. The problem is we've consistently made these pledges in the past, as you say,
and isn't that the problem?
This time we have to follow through.
But isn't that the problem, let's face it though, that it's always, countries that matter pledging, making quite ambitious pledges, but not really following through? I mean, does it really matter what small countries pledge or even do when it is bigger climate culprits like the US, like China and others that need to take those serious actions?
Well, it matters both large and small. Obviously, for the global carbon and global methane budget, it's the big countries' inputs that are really critical. But it matters that everyone acts, and it matters for two reasons. One is that we need to build this global clean energy and sustainable agriculture and green building industry worldwide. And we also know that we won't get political buy-in unless the benefits of clean go to everyone, not just the rich. And the best way to do that is to build projects out in large countries, in small countries, in poor communities, as well as in rich communities.
You mentioned that all countries has to do their fair share when it comes to combating climate change, but the US is the largest historic emitter. In fact, it pledged $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund to help low-income and middle-income countries deal with the consequences of climate change and adapt. Biden is asking Congress for $1.6 billion, but we know he's unlikely to get it. Should the US be doing far more? In fact, according to some estimates, the US should contribute 40 to 47% of the $100 billion that was pledged annually by 2020, obviously something that hasn't been met.
So there's several aspects of that. One is that the US should be doing more. The US should be a larger contributor. Actually, President Biden announced the largest single increase in US giving that would ramp up the US total to about $12 billion. But the real calculus is actually the one based on the 2005 pledges at the Paris Climate Agreement. And that was that there should be an annual fund of $100 billion, which won't solve climate, but will get us investing on a regular basis in poor countries. And the critical issue is that that's not $100 billion once, that's $100 billion every year. This year was the first time that the global community hit that, largely because some very large philanthropies and private donors in the United States stepped up dramatically. So we met it this year in the COP26 meeting in November 2021. And the challenge, though, is can we do the same thing again at COP27 in Egypt in November? And it's that story, which we don't know. I am probably most heartened, though, by the fact that this is the first time the US has ever had a climate investment of this scale. The new brokered deal between the Democrats done by conservative Senator Manchin from West Virginia and Senator Schumer from New York has unlocked this $360 billion investment in clean energy. That's the first time we've seen that. And part of that will certainly be channeled to our overseas commitments.
All right, Daniel Kammen, former science envoy for the State Department, thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you.
Now, while scientists have been warning for decades about the devastating impacts of rising temperatures, which we now see all around us, they say the Earth is getting so hot that political leaders may have less than a decade to prevent the accelerating climate crisis from reaching a point of no return, if it hasn't already. A year ago, the UN called the warning, quote, a code red for humanity. As we get dangerously close to potentially catastrophic global warming, it isn't just the world's smallest and poorest countries that will suffer the consequences of the actions of some of the world's biggest and wealthiest nations. It is all of humanity. That's all from me, Gurib-Fakim, and the team. Thanks for watching. See you next time.